We did want to get some of the Panama Papers in there, and one of the things, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and give you guys a quick summary of what we're going to talk about, and I think we're going to save some of it for a future episode. So if you came expecting it, then you'll get some, but you can look forward to catching more of it on the next episode or in a future episode. But essentially, what we were talking about is okay. So I guess we'll start. Are we ready for the clip with Ben, real quick? That would probably be the best way
Yeah,
to start.
let's preface this still.
Okay, yeah. So basically, on the 4th, if you go back to the Benjamin Dixon channel and you look at the videos, you'll find he was talking about the Panama Papers, among some other things. And I believe it starts at about where was it? Or about 45 or 43 minutes into it is the part that we're going to be showing. And basically, this is just going to be a quick little explanation of what actually happened. And then what I'm going to do afterwards is try to use what we've been talking about before and on previous shows. And I noticed some comments before about Nicaragua and the Sandinistas being discussed and how all that ties together and what that has to do with the election today. So go ahead and let Ben speak to us, if you will.
Just a second. I'll click the play button when I find it.
Here, over 2.6 terabytes of data was released anonymously to, essentially, it was the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. They got a hold of this data. 2.6 millions of documents, far more than the 250,000 documents released by WikiLeaks. These millions of documents were then sorted by over 300 different agencies, journalists and agencies, and today was the day that they released the very first portion of their findings. Today's portion of their findings seems to have targeted non-American transgressions. Let's just say it like that. Today did not focus on America. Today was international. And you get to see how the rich and the famous really hide their wealth, not only legitimate wealth that they created through their businesses, but also wealth that was obtained illegally. There's mentions of drug cartel wealth in there, illegal funding corporations that are still funding tax in Syria. The most interesting, one of the biggest stories that jumped out for me was millions of dollars in gold that was stolen in 1983. And you wonder where people actually take money from major heists like this. According to the Panama Papers, this corporation, this law firm, Mossack, I can't say it right, it's the Mossack Fonseca, actually helped launder that money and create a shell corporation to give the people who participated in that that crime access to their wealth, to their newfound wealth. So it's really a who's who of stars, sports figures, politicians, dictators, and criminals, all participating or all getting services from this one company, this one firm out of Panama. And
all right, yeah, and so one of the main things that we're going to pick up on from that is about the drug trade part of it and the financing and laundering of drug money through there. And I'm going to try to expose. Oh, excuse me, sorry about that. And we're going to try and expose the thread, the common thread that leads us all the way from the 80s and Nicaragua, the Sandinistas, and Reagan and the invasion of Panama, or right through to the invasion of Panama and Noriega and the role Noriega played with the CIA, and then the CIA that played in the drug distribution in America, and then also try to highlight the thread as far as how that incorporated in the war against the poor, or war on poverty, or the war on drugs, and how those are all connected, and then how that connects to today's election. Now, I had segmented originally more time for that, and I wanted to really dive into it, especially, but we were covering a lot of different things up front and explaining some things about the show, and some of the other things ran over, and really want to engage with you guys about what you guys are talking about. And so what we're going to do is focus on the aspects that I mentioned that were mentioned in chat earlier, but also pertain to the Panama Papers. And so I guess in a way to start, we're not going all the way back, but we're going back a ways to the 80s and the role in which the relationship between the United States and Panama and Nicaragua during the 80s. And Nis, are you familiar with that? And I know people will have various levels of familiarity with it, so I don't want to rehash too much of it, but I also want to cover as much as we can.
Familiarity is there's a guy called Noriega who was a trained CIA operative, and they succeeded in getting him into power as president, but then he stopped taking directives on some issues from Washington, and then some soldiers were sent in to remove him, and then he was put in prison. That is the gist of what I know about Noriega.
Yeah, I mean that basic. I mean, it's a reasonable summary. Some of the other things about Noriega, while he was working with the CIA, is Medellin cartel, which of fame, Pablo Escobar. So he was supposedly an informant, and there's various degrees of validity to some of the stories, and some of it is conspiracy talk and all these types of things. So it's really tough when you dig into these things. Not to mention when you go that far back. You're not looking at internet documents. You're looking at documents that were put onto the internet, and so separately. And so it's the ones that have made it through that process that you're able to see. It's really tough to get the original context of any of the documents to know for sure exactly what you're looking at. But essentially, the CIA was also helping using Panama, and as a result, the de facto dictator, more or less, and it wasn't official until later. Noriega to pass those weapons onto the Contras to try and fight against the Sandinista government and to undermine that movement. And many people are familiar with the Sandinistas as they've come up a little bit with Bernie and that talk. And we could go more into that, but I think due to time limitations, I want to try to progress to get us to today. And so the CIA basically was fine with Noriega both selling drugs and moving these weapons, so long as he was doing it and so long as he wasn't asking for too much and he was willing to pay what they needed. And it goes on like that until at one point Noriega is about to lose an election, and he basically calls a halt to the vote. And most reports say that he would have lost that election, but instead he said that it was basically no confidence in the election, declared himself dictator. The U.S. uses this as a defense or as reasoning to go in and invade Panama, and also mentions the Panama Canal, uses that as the military defense, or that we were defending our interest in Panama Canal as a reason to use the military. But up until that point, we had been provoking, and there was a long list, and essentially it's what you would expect for if all of a sudden, you were fine with somebody dealing drugs and moving the drugs, but now the terms have not become amenable to you anymore. And so now what you do is you crack down on the things that you turned a blind eye towards for literally over a decade. And so they crack down on Noriega and imprison him, and they use the Panama Canal and his drug trading and the hiding of drug money in Panama banks to shut it down. John Kerry did an investigation of fame. This is where Ollie North and all that stuff comes out. So if you're familiar with that, Ollie North, Panama, the Contras, those are subjects that you want to look more into if you haven't found out about them or you're not familiar, and you'll get more details about how that worked. But you'll notice that is one of the times where the illegal banking practices of Panama were put in the front. And what we had was the IBBC, I believe that's what it is, and it's an international bank. It was run, I think, owned mostly by a Saudi man with questionable ties. Anyway, that bank was investigated, or came under investigation with Kerry, and one of the things, it was during the Cold War, or the end of the Cold War, and they ended up closing it down. But in the closing down process, the people, as we've become accustomed to now, instead of going to prison or anything like that, they were fined. And so essentially the end outcome of what we know was, somewhat violent reign in Panama and massive amounts of trafficking of both guns and weapons and drugs, and moving all of that money. The person that facilitated that financially, the group, the entity, ended up facing a small fine, and that was basically and got disillusioned. But the son of the largest shareholder inherited enough to make his own bank, and is now basically the Saudi king's private bank. So they're doing okay. Now Noriega, coincidentally also brown skin, is in prison and is basically has been over the last 30 years in some form of discussion about moving from one prison to another, and with a brief stint as trying to get a court case as for his portrayal in Call of Duty 2, saying that they used his persona without his permission. That case was eventually thrown out, but I thought that was a little funny tidbit that I picked up while doing this research. So I guess that covers us through Noriega. Now, what I mentioned Noriega in prison. One of the reasons why I bring that up, and I'll come back to that at the end, is that we're, as a nation, and specifically as a nation, we're really good at imprisoning and punishing brown and black people for drugs. But what we're not so good at doing is imprisoning or punishing the white people or wealthy people, primarily white, that help facilitate the financial happenings, as we've seen with HSBC, where they were basically found to have been moving billions of dollars in drug money, to which they naturally did what anybody would do, is just pay a fine, which is obviously what you do if you get pulled over by the cops with $5 million in cash in your trunk, right? You just pay a fine, no questions asked, they move right along. No, that's not what happens to people when they're in the streets and they're moving the substances that these people are profiting from. Those people end up in prison or dead. And so, like, we're really good at punishing and making it very dangerous for those people, and if you're a financier of these operations, it seems to be a pretty reasonably safe and lucrative operation for you. And so that's one of the... Go ahead.
That truism from that HBO TV show, The Wire. Remember that truism that, what's he called? The old black cop who's so... never mind. You remember it?
Yeah. You're basically... Oh, I forget the line exactly, and you said it really well earlier.
Follow the drugs, and all you get are poor black people killing each other. Follow the money, and you find influential white people. So don't follow the money.
Yeah, yes, exactly, because it's these influential institutions, UBS, HSBC, Barclays, JP Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup. Some of these are very familiar as some top contributors to Hillary Clinton's campaign, if that sounds familiar also. These organizations some of them are very notorious, especially UBS is notorious for corrupt business practices, especially in Latin America. So it's not as if we're lobbing random accusations or anything. It's pretty well known from a global perspective that many of these institutions regularly bribe people and are engaged in various forms of corruption. And what they do, though, is that they do an incredibly good job of making sure that their liabilities or the legal vulnerabilities from such actions are minimal or non-existent, by diffusing them, by making sure that they go to international tribunals that basically go nowhere and get no attention paid to them. And so there's a very elaborate way that they go about doing this, so that, in fact, that they're not generally violating laws, at least not on first appearance, that it takes a much more in-depth and concerted effort to expose what looks like to anybody who isn't familiar with it like blatant corruption, but to those experienced with it, know it's within the laws that they have regarding what they're able to do to exploit these loopholes. And so I guess moving on from a bit from the 80s in Panama and what was going on there, and kind of leaping forward a bit into when the Panama trade deal, which is kind of how this relates to our election, in that Bernie came out and mentioned that, hey, in 2011 I was telling you this Panama trade deal was a bad idea. We shouldn't have done it in the first place. Hillary Clinton was out there saying it's a great idea, so don't forget that. Well, before that, in 2007, there was already the deal, as some people have heard, that the Bush administration was negotiating, which was the skeleton on which Obama and Clinton built the rest of this trade deal that Panama had that Bernie was criticizing. In that deal, at the time, or I should say, it's been characterized in a variety of ways, but I just wanted to give people some background on how this actually happened. According to an article from, let's see here, is Richie Torres in New York, or excuse me, no, I'm sorry, that's something else I wrote down for a different note. Richie Torres is a young black councilman in New York who did a segment I mentioned earlier about with Lawrence O'Donnell about the projects in New York. Great, look him up, check out his Twitter. I believe it's at Richie Torres, but sorry for the sidetrack. Anyway, the article is by Stephen Wiseman, and in May of 2007, he says, the Bush administration reached an agreement on Thursday with the House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and other Democrats to attach environmental worker protection in several pending trade agreements, clearing the way for early passage of some pacts and improving prospects for others. And so one of the things that was happening when they were originally negotiating with Bush, who wanted to just have the raw trade deal with none of the protections that either Obama or that are quoted here or mentioned here from Democrats and Pelosi in 2007. It started as that, and then Pelosi and the Democrats came on board and said, well, we need some sort of environmental regulations and some worker protections, which I won't have time to really get into here right now, but if you look into, the workers in Panama are not doing well, and as an example, let's see here, the income inequality in Panama is almost off the charts. They're in the top 10. Brazil comes in at 52 on the Gini index, and Panama at 51. 0 would be a perfect score for a perfectly equitable society. The U.S. comes in somewhere in around 40, just to give some perspective. And the poverty that they're facing is abject poverty, like Nis mentioned earlier about that some folks are facing in the United States, but on a grand scale that, according to a NPR article from 2014, of the 3.5 million people in Panama, more than half of the country's children are poor, and almost a fifth suffer from malnutrition. So, one of the other interesting statistics I saw was the indigenous people of Panama, which I myself am somewhat guilty of not mentioning enough in this so far. The indigenous people of Panama, 85% of them live in extreme poverty, meaning that they can't afford enough. They can't afford enough calories to have a normal diet. So just on their diet alone, they're in an extreme poverty, and it's 85%. The situation in Panama is disgraceful, essentially, is my point. And the notion that this trade deal made it better is a stretch at best. And so what does that then, how does that lead to this, our current election? Essentially, UBS has been facing money laundering schemes in a variety of places, in France, in Belgium, in the United States, and for what's called the LIBOR rate manipulation. That, again, some of the banks I mentioned before, UBS, JP Morgan, Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Dutch Bank, Royal Bank, these are all banks that have been wrapped up in these essentially cases from the government that show that they messed up, that they were doing something criminal, but we already know that nobody's going to go to prison. So it's really just about how strong is their case, so how big is the fine. So whenever you see these things, it's always about how big is the fine going to be. And I guess I've been going on here for a minute, but just to kind of wrap it up, the banks I've mentioned and UBS, there's an article that was put out by, let's see here, where to go. Oh, I should also mention this same trade deal was also lobbied by Rupert Murdoch, the parent company or owner of parent company News Corp, Fox News. So when you see Rupert Murdoch and Republicans and some Democrats all agreeing on something, that should be something that really concerns you. And Rupert Murdoch was, the version he was advocating for was the 2011 version, the one after Obama and Clinton had allegedly gotten the concessions that they wanted regarding labor and regarding environmental protections. I have other statistics here. Mentions that about 50% of the organic waste or pollution in Panama is from herbicides. So one of the things that came off the Panama deal was basically U.S. companies were able to ship large amounts of fertilizer and other products in duty-free. So that really helped people like Chiquita Banana which is a U.S.-owned company but owns a lot of land in Panama where a lot of their bananas are grown. And one of the things that disgusted me out of that, just to put a cap on how bad it is in Panama, is that in order to address the weeding issue or the weed issue of having or herbicides leaking into the water and polluting the people, the rural communities' water sources, was to have them manually pick weeds from these banana plantations. So if you can imagine people manually picking weeds on a banana plantation in the hot weather with we're not talking with tools or anything like that, but their solution to what is the word I'm looking for large-scale agricultural weeding was just to have people on their hands and knees pulling weeds out. That's the kind of working conditions that people there are dealing with, along with being in some absurd poverty, some of the most inequitable living conditions in the world. And so to show again how that plays into this is that one of the banks that was wrapped up in all of this was UBS, and I'm just looking here so I can make sure I get all the names right here. But essentially, okay, so here it is. The UBS, Hillary Clinton, some of you may be aware of this, but basically as soon as one of her first things that she did as Secretary of State was bail UBS out of legal contentions about some of the problems that they were involved with the crash. And shortly after that, Bill Clinton, there's an article, it's by Connor, I'm going to butcher this name, Friedersdorf. It was back in July of 2015, and you can find it on The Atlantic. And I believe Oman Reagan recently tweeted it out, and so like if you're not following him, go ahead and check him out. And let's see here. Let's see here. Oh yeah, I was gonna just checking some things behind the scenes. I've been going on here. I was just trying to wrap all this up in a really tight package here for us. They reported Bill gets paid $1.5 billion. The foundation goes on. The Bill and Hillary Clinton or Chelsea Clinton, I don't know what the name is right now, but the Clinton Foundation went on to receive $30 million in loans and another tens of millions of dollars in donations as well. And all of those are what leads us to what I hope Bernie is going to bring up in the debate tonight about release the transcripts. Okay, maybe this is all an innocent coincidence. Maybe, your relationship with these banks, I didn't even cover it, but Arkansas's relationship with the Panama drug money and Bill Clinton's ascendancy in Arkansas, or all those things. Maybe they are all just coincidences, just an extremely unlikely series of coincidences, and it just happened that, these all happened to you. Put our minds at ease. Just release the transcripts. I mean, you intentionally recorded what you said, presumably so people could observe them at a future date and time. And the excuse that you're waiting for Republicans to release theirs, first off, you're going to need to tell me which Republicans' transcripts you're waiting for, who they spoke to, and when they spoke to that you want to hear. Because without those, we're not going to know whether they've even fulfilled whatever arbitrary goal you're setting for them. So which speeches from who are you waiting to be released for before you follow their leadership and release your own? That's my question to Hillary is who and which speeches and when are you going to release your transcripts? That's what I would love to see Bernie confront her on today. And as I mentioned, there's more, and we can go into detail, but the Panama Papers expose that there's basically a pay-to-play politics going on, and it's happening in the U.S., and we're using places like Latin America as our puppets or as our whatever you want to call them to hide all of it and pretend like we're all above board and they're the evil ones when it's really us. Whether it's the drugs or whether it's the money, it's us. It's our demand that makes them exist. It's not them, it's not a wicked marketing plan by Panama and Colombia to sell cocaine to the United States that has them selling so much cocaine to the United States. It's an unquenchable desire for those drugs in the United States that has them looking at drug production, despite all the violence that it brings, as a viable way to lift their people from poverty. And so with that, I'll let you get some closing words in here.
Yeah, I mean, regarding Hillary, I think we're all waiting for Hillary to see the Republicans show leadership so that she can follow them, because that's, of course, what you do. I mean, she's talking about holding other people, she's being held to unfair standards. because other people won't be held to the other standards. You know what? I will gladly make the same shout out to any other presidential candidate who is running, any other presidential candidate who's done speeches in front of banks or other huge special interests and been paid huge amounts of money for it. Right after I was secretary, that person was Secretary of State or some other high office, and right before that person went into a presidential contest. But I can't seem to think of any. But, you point them out, and I will gladly demand that they release the transcripts as well. By the way, 70 days and counting since you said you would look into releasing the transcripts, just for those of us who are keeping record.